everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bells that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Lesley Molseed. She was a young girl from the northwest of England and she suddenly disappeared one day in October of 1975 during her walk to the local shop. When Lesley vanished, a big search ensued to try and find her, and tragically soon after she went missing, her body was found. She had been murdered, but it wasn't long before the police had a prime suspect in the case. They identified a man that they instantly believed was responsible for Lesley's murder, despite the fact that there was next to no real evidence linking him to the crime. This case would actually go down in history as being one of the worst miscarriages of justice that Britain has ever seen, in fact, as an innocent man spent years and years behind bars for a crime that he did not commit, whilst Lesley's real killer was able to fly under the radar and escape capture for more than 3 decades. But quickly before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a young girl and it involves heavy themes such as violence towards a child, sexual assault and abuse against children, paedophilia, domestic violence, mental and emotional abuse, homophobia and police misconduct. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back nearly 48 years now to 1975 in Rockdale, which is a town located in Greater Manchester in England. And this is Lesley Molseed. She was an 11-year-old girl who lived in Rockdale with her family. Specifically, she lived with her family in a house on the Turf Hill estate in Rockdale. Lesley was born on the 14th of August 1964 to parents Fred Anderson and April Molseed. However, Fred and April were separated, and by the time this case took place, April was married to a man named Danny, so Danny became Lesley's stepfather. And Lesley was one of 4 children, the youngest of 4 children. She had 2 older sisters named Julie and Laura, and also an older brother named Freddie. And by all accounts, the Molseed family were just a very normal, happy family, and Lesley was a happy little girl. She was very smiley, always had a smile on her face. She was a very chatty child. She loved to chat. She was friendly and bubbly. Her father said that she could be very cheeky at times. And Lesley adored music. Specifically, she was obsessed with the pop band the Bay City Rollers. Her mother April said that Lesley and her sister Laura would bicker quite often because Laura herself loved the Bay City Rollers too, and she had these like Bay City Roller posters in her bedroom, and Lesley would just go in and take them. She would pinch them and put them up in her bedroom. Lesley was a very angelic little girl. She had this lovely black curly hair. She was a very tiny little girl. She was 11 years old, but she probably looked a lot younger because she only weighed about 3 stone. Her father said that she looked like butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, and as well as looking a lot younger physically, her mental age was actually a lot younger too. You see, Lesley was born with a heart condition, and at 3 years old she had to undergo open heart surgery to try and fix this. However, according to sources, this open heart surgery actually had an effect on her development, both physically and mentally. So she was always a very small, frail little girl, and she had a learning disability. And I read on one article that by 11 years old she actually had the mental age of a 4-year-old, so she was very vulnerable, bless her. The date that this case occurred was the 5th of October 1975. It was a Sunday, a weekend, so Lesley was obviously at home that day. And around midday, around like 12:30 p.m, Lesley's mother April asked her daughter to run a quick errand for her. She gave Lesley some money and she asked her to pop to the local shop to pick up a loaf of bread and an air freshener. So Lesley put on her shoes, she put on her blue raincoat, she grabbed her blue bag and she walked out of the door and headed to the shop, which was only about a 10-minute walk away from her home, and it was a journey that Lesley had taken many many times before. She was often sent to the local shop by her mother. That was one of her chores. So the route to the shop was one that she was very familiar with, and yet for some reason on this particular day, Lesley never returned home. In fact, it's not even known if she ever made it to the shop, as the shopkeeper couldn't recall whether or not they had seen Lesley in there that afternoon. The last place that Lesley was seen that day was an alleyway called Stewart's Lane, which was a part of her route to and from the shop. A couple of Lesley's friends and members of the public saw her walking along this pedestrian alleyway. However, she was not seen again after this. This was the last sighting of her because, as I said, she never returned home. When she didn't return home, her mother April immediately became concerned because this was not like Lesley. She wasn't the type to just go off and not let her mum know where she was. If she wanted to stay out and play with friends, she would make sure to ask her mum first. And so April sent one of her other daughters, Laura, out to look for her little sister. However, Laura had no luck. And so other family members and friends of the family went out searching too. They were looking along the streets, looking along the roads that Lesley would have taken to the shop, but they never found her. There was no sign of 11-year-old Lesley Molseed. And so just a couple of hours after she left the house to go to the shop at approximately 3 p.m, Lesley's mother April contacted the West Yorkshire police to report her youngest child as missing. Immediately, a police search for Lesley began. They started conducting searches on foot, sending police officers out to look for any trace of Lesley along the streets all around Rockdale and also along the adjacent M62 motorway. They had a helicopter scan the area from above to see if they could spot anything. They started taking statements from people and carrying out door-to-door inquiries, asking the neighbours if they had seen or heard anything. Missing posters with Lesley's face on were created and distributed, but unfortunately, there was nothing. No one had any idea what had happened to Lesley that afternoon. No one knew where she went after those last sightings on Stewart's Lane. And as the hours and the days ticked by, of course, everyone's hopes that she would be found safe and well just decreased and decreased. It seemed more and more likely that if Lesley was found, she may not be alive. Tragically, she may have even been the victim of foul play. And just 3 days after she disappeared, this theory was sadly confirmed to be true, because on the 8th of October 1975, her dead body was found. At around 8 in the morning on the 8th of October, a man who had been travelling along the A672 road near the Rishworth Moor in West Yorkshire, which is about a 20-minute drive away from Rockdale, he had been parked in a lay-by that morning just off of the A672 road. He'd been parked there all night actually, as I think he'd been driving for a long time, so he decided to pull over in this lay-by and get some sleep in his car. And when he woke up the next morning at around 8 a.m, he got out of his car and he needed the toilet. So he walked up the embankment next to the lay-by onto the Yorkshire moors, and that was when he spotted something on the ground in the distance. He saw what he thought at first was just a bundle of clothes on the ground, and so he walked closer to this bundle, and that was when he realised that it wasn't a bundle of clothes after all. He had actually found the dead body of a young girl, a child. This was, of course, the body of missing 11-year-old Lesley Molseed. Lesley had been brutally murdered. It's believed in the spot where she was found, she was killed on the moors, so she must have been abducted on the afternoon that she went missing, and then her killer took her to this area, and that's where she died. She was clothed when she was found. She was discovered in the same clothes that she had been wearing on the day that she vanished, and it was later determined in her autopsy that Lesley had been stabbed to death with a knife. She had sustained 12 stab wounds to her body in total. She'd been stabbed in her neck, her back, her upper shoulder, and one of these stab wounds was so deep that it penetrated her heart. Sources state that she didn't really have any defensive wounds to her body. I mean, as we know, she was a tiny, tiny little thing, so she wouldn't have been able to put up much of a fight against her attacker at all. She had no chance, and it was also determined in her autopsy that tragically Lesley had also been the victim of a sexual assault too, and traces of semen were detected on her clothing, specifically in her knickers, so it was clear that this brutal murder was sexually motivated. Now, unfortunately, this semen evidence obviously wasn't going to be very useful at the time because this was the mid-70s and DNA technology just was not a thing yet. They wouldn't be able to get a DNA profile from this semen and, you know, compare it against any suspects because they just didn't have the tools at their disposal to do that. But upon finding Lesley's body, of course, what was a missing persons investigation now turned into a murder inquiry. Now, instead of searching for Lesley, the police had the task of searching for her killer, and quickly, before they potentially struck again. As you can imagine, news of Lesley's horrific death quickly spread around the local area, and everyone was just completely devastated and terrified. Parents of young children were terrified because there was a child sexual predator and killer on the loose. And you have to remember that this was a time when most parents would allow their young children to go out on their own, to go and play with friends because they thought it was safe for them to do so. But now that Lesley had been killed, of course, a lot of parents in the area stopped that. They stopped letting their kids go out alone out of fear that they could be next. So as part of the police's investigation to find the killer, they decided to appeal to the public. They asked for anyone who may have had any information about Lesley's murder to come forward, or any information that could possibly be related to Lesley's murder. So like, had they seen anything strange, anyone acting suspiciously that they thought might have been of interest to the police. And it was following this when the police received one particular lead that they decided to look into further. The police were contacted by a couple of young girls, and they told them that just 2 days before Lesley was killed, on the evening of the 3rd of October 1975, they were at the local youth club when a man exposed himself in front of them, I think just outside of the youth club, and they later identified the man that did this as being Stefan Kiszko. Now, according to sources, it wasn't actually Stefan that they saw exposing himself. It was in fact a local milkman, and apparently the milkman who did expose himself was actually just going to the toilet outside by the youth club. He wasn't purposefully showing them his private parts, he was just going to the toilet. But regardless, these girls went to the police and they told them that Stefan was the one who did it. So they either lied or they just mistook him for being the one that exposed himself. But whatever the case, when the police received this lead, they started looking further into Stefan, and they instantly believed that he fit the profile of the man that murdered Lesley Molseed. So just for a bit of extra information about Stefan Kiszko, he was 23 years old at the time that this case took place. He was born in 1952 to his parents Iwan and Charlotte Kiszko, although sadly Iwan had passed away by the time this case occurred, so Stefan lived with just his mother, I believe. But both his mother and father had emigrated to Rockdale after the Second World War, and Rockdale is where Stefan grew up, so he was a local man. He worked as a tax clerk and he was well known in the local area. Most people in the community knew who he was, and the majority of people that knew him actually thought that he was quite odd. He was different. It turns out that Stefan, much like Lesley, also had a learning disability, which meant that his mental age was a lot younger than he was. He was 23, but it was determined by a psychologist that he probably had the mental age of a 12-year-old. It's believed that he was probably autistic, and he had this hobby of making note of the number plates on cars that he had seen, and this could be an example of a character trait of an autistic person. Often someone on the autistic spectrum can have a kind of intense hobby or interest in something, and Stefan's was that he enjoyed jotting down license plates. plate. Now, today, autism is a developmental disability that most people are aware of, that most people have an understanding of. But back when this case took place in the 70s, not many people really understood it. They didn't understand Stefan. They didn't understand that he had a learning disability and developmental disability. They just saw him as strange and odd. And so did the police, actually. When they started looking into Stefan, they thought that he was a strange man. And so to them, he fit the bill. He fit the profile of the kind of man that they believed had killed Lesley Molseed. They decided to conduct a search of Stefan Kiszko's car to see if they could find any evidence in there which may have linked him to Lesley's murder. And they apparently found some pornography in there, pornographic magazines, as well as some sweets. And to the police, this appeared to be solid evidence. They seemed to theorize that he had sweets in his car to lure children into his vehicle. They thought that perhaps that's how he abducted Lesley. He promised to give her some sweets. They also found some carpet fibers in his car that were apparently similar to carpet fibers that were found on Lesley's body. And I also read in one article that in Stefan's notebook where he jotted down car number plates, the police found that he had jotted down the number plate of one car that had apparently been seen near the embankment where Lesley's body was found, near the crime scene. Now, I'm sure you'll all agree with me when I say that this evidence connecting Stefan to the crime, I mean, it was barely evidence at all. There was nothing concrete linking him to the murder. It was all circumstantial evidence, if you can even call it that, let's be honest. But despite that, it appears as though the detectives in this case just immediately jumped to the conclusion that Stefan Kiszko must have been the killer. Because of this evidence, and because he was seen as a little bit odd, and because those girls had lied or mistook him for being the man that exposed himself, the police quickly believed that he was the perpetrator. Stefan quickly became the top suspect in the case, and so he was arrested just over 2 months after Lesley was killed. On the 21st of December 1975, Stefan was arrested on suspicion of her murder. He was interviewed by the detectives and he was just on his own in the interview. He didn't have a solicitor with him. Obviously today, people who are being interviewed by the police have a right to a solicitor. As soon as a suspect asks for one, the police are required to stop the interview then and there until they get a solicitor. But that law wasn't created until the 80s. So in 1975, when Stefan was arrested, he didn't have a solicitor present during his questioning. And you have to remember that he was such a vulnerable young man. He had the mental age of someone who was a lot younger. So I can imagine that he didn't really understand what was going on. He underwent 3 whole days of very intensive questioning with the detectives until eventually on the 3rd day, he confessed. He confessed to the murder of Lesley Molseed, but it's believed that he was actually forced into this confession by the detectives because, you see, Stefan was actually innocent. He had nothing to do with what happened to Lesley, but the police were under a lot of pressure from the general public to find the killer. A child had been brutally murdered, so the pressure was on to find the perpetrator, and so they wanted to wrap up this case as quickly as they could. And Stefan seemed like an easy target. They had next to no real evidence against him, but yet they kept trying to pin it on him. And as I said, after 3 days of very intense questioning, they managed to get him to confess to the murder of Lesley Molseed. He gave a false confession under pressure. He later withdrew this confession, I believe, once he actually did get himself a solicitor, and he said that the only reason he confessed was because he was scared. He was worried that the police were going to hurt him if he didn't confess, and it was clear to him that a confession was what they wanted, so he believed that if he gave them that, they would let him go. They would let him go home to his mother. Who knows, perhaps the police even told him that that would be the case. We don't know exactly what was said to Stefan, so perhaps they indicated that if he confessed, everything would be okay. day, he could go home, and he believed them, but that's just speculation on my part. On the same day that he gave this confession, Stefan Kiszko was charged with murder, and about 7 to 8 months later, the case went to trial at Leeds Crown Court, and this trial could not have gone worse for Stefan Kiszko. It was just an absolute shambles. For starters, his defense team, the people who were supposed to be fighting his corner, trying to prove to the jury that he was innocent, that he was not this vicious killer that the police and prosecution were making him out to be, actually didn't really have his back at all. Their tactic during the trial was very questionable. They basically said to the jury, "We don't think Stefan killed Lesley, but if you think he did, why not find him guilty of manslaughter rather than murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility?" Now, just to give a bit of extra context here, the reason they decided to try the diminished responsibility defense was because Stefan actually had this condition called hypogonadism, which basically meant that he did not produce enough of the hormone testosterone, which can obviously have an effect on one's development, and it would have had an effect on Stefan's puberty stage in his teenage years. Now, not long before Lesley's murder, Stefan started receiving injections of the testosterone hormone by his doctor, and it's thought that as a result of this, Stefan would have been getting normal sexual urges and sexual arousal for the first time at 23 years old. Whilst most men and boys obviously get these feelings when they are a lot younger in their teenage years, Stefan was only just now getting them because he was now receiving testosterone. And so from what I can gather, the defense argued that because of all of this, he couldn't necessarily control himself. If he did kill Lesley, it was manslaughter because the sudden surge of testosterone meant that he couldn't control these new sexual urges. And the defense team put forward this argument without consulting their client first. They did not have permission from Stefan to use this as a defense. He obviously wanted them to prove that he was innocent of the crime, and instead they were essentially screwing him over. They were telling the jury to consider convicting him of manslaughter rather than murder instead of acquitting him of all charges. If anything, the defense was basically helping the prosecution's case. However, something that the defense team did not know, some information that the police conveniently withheld from them, was that due to his hypogonadism, Stefan Kiszko could not actually produce sperm. He was infertile, and yet the semen that had been found in Lesley Molseed's knickers, the killer semen, did have traces of sperm in it. So that was a huge piece of evidence in itself to prove that Stefan was not the killer. He couldn't have been because he did not produce sperm heads, and the police knew that, and they just did not mention it. The defense had no clue about it, and so of course neither did the jury. They withheld evidence which proved that Stefan was innocent just because they wanted that conviction. So it was no surprise when at the end of Stefan's trial, he was found guilty. He was found guilty of Lesley's murder and sentenced to life in prison. He was an extremely vulnerable young man, and he was going to be spending the rest of his life behind bars for a crime that he did not commit. And as you can imagine, his time in prison was absolutely horrific, given the nature of the crime that he was convicted of, the sexual assault and murder of a child. Paedophiles and child killers are understandably at the very bottom of the hierarchy in prisons. They are despised by the other inmates, and so they are often the targets of very violent attacks, and Stefan Kiszko was very much a target. He was attacked several times in prison. He received constant death threats. He had to receive several stitches in his head at one point after he was attacked with a mop handle. He was punched, kicked, beaten. Often he would have to be kept in solitary confinement because of all of these attacks. So he was just on his own in his cell. His mental health seriously declined over the years behind bars. Sources state that he started suffering from schizophrenia and he would experience psychosis and delusions. But despite that, he never gave up the fight to prove his innocence. He always maintained throughout his time in prison that he had been wrongfully convicted, that he had nothing to do with Lesley's death. And his mother, Charlotte, in particular, fought so incredibly hard to prove her son's innocence. She never for 1 second believed that he had murdered Lesley. She just knew that her son would never have done anything like that. And so while Stefan was locked up, Charlotte was an advocate for him. She campaigned tirelessly for her son's case to be reviewed and for him to be released. She would contact anyone and everyone that she thought might be able to help her, including politicians. However, she was just ignored and ignored over and over again, or at least that was until the late 80s. So by this point, Stefan had been in prison for well over a decade, and Charlotte was finally put in contact with someone who was willing to help her, someone who also believed in Stefan's innocence, a solicitor named Campbell Malone. He began looking extensively into the case. He launched an appeal, and in 1991, he managed to persuade the Home Office to review and reopen the case in a bid to clear Stefan's name. And of course, as part of this review, it was found that the West Yorkshire Police had made many huge errors in their investigation into Lesley's murder in 1975. The main one, of course, being that it was found that they had withheld the information regarding the semen evidence. They hadn't disclosed the fact that the killer's semen had sperm in it and that Stefan Kiszko did not produce sperm. In addition to that, it was found that there was a witness who was able to confirm Stefan's alibi on the day of the murder. He had told the police that at the time of the murder, he was with his aunt and they were visiting his father's grave. And a member of the public who saw him at the grave was able to confirm this. However, again, conveniently, they weren't asked by the police to give evidence during the 1976 trial because it was just another thing that proved Stefan's innocence. And as well as that, when the case was reopened in the early 90s, the young girls who identified Stefan as being the man who exposed himself to them just 2 days before Lesley's murder, well, by this point in time, they were obviously a lot older, around their late 20s, early 30s. And according to sources, they actually finally admitted that they had lied. They admitted that they were wrong about Stefan exposing himself. And so, as a result of these findings, in February of 1992, Stefan Kiszko, who by this point was around 40 years old, was finally acquitted and released from prison. He had spent 17 years in prison before he was released, before it was finally proven that he was an innocent man. As I said at the start of this video, this was, and still remains to this day, one of the worst miscarriages of justice that Britain has ever seen. Following Stefan's release, he did a couple of TV interviews about his terrible ordeal. He spoke about his time in prison. He talked about how the police essentially framed him for Lesley's murder. If I'm able to insert some video clips of his TV interviews, I will do so now.
Well, I was in a way framed because, you know, the detectives just said, we'll just get it all wrapped up for Christmas and just end it somehow one way or another.
But despite being released, despite finally being free, Stefan still continued to struggle a lot with his mental health. Apparently, he found it really difficult to adjust to people being nice to him. Obviously, now that it had been finally proven that he was innocent, people's attitudes towards him changed. For the last 17 years, people had treated him like he was scum because they thought he was a child killer. But now that his name had been cleared, people were finally kind to him. They had sympathy for him, which he really struggled to deal with because he wasn't used to that. So to now all of a sudden have that support and kindness from people, it almost scared him. But by the looks of it, he was trying to remain positive. He said in his TV interviews that he had hopes for the future. He hoped to marry and he hoped to go on nice holidays. He hoped to have all of the opportunities that he had missed out on for the last nearly 2 decades. But sadly, Stefan would never get to do those things that he was so looking forward to, because the year following his release in October of 1993, he was diagnosed with angina, and just 2 months later in December, he passed away after suffering a heart attack in his home. He was only free for about a year and 10 months before he died, and he died before he actually got any compensation money. He had been told that he would receive about £500,000 in compensation because of what he had been through, but he died before the payout was made, as did his mother Charlotte. She tragically died just 6 months after her son in May of 1994. Stefan's story is just heartbreaking. The fact that he spent so long locked up for something that he didn't do, and then he wasn't even free for 2 years before he died. It's horrific, and it's unimaginable just how terrifying and soul-destroying those 17 years he spent behind bars must have been for him. My heart breaks for him and his family, and also, of course, Lesley's family too. I can only imagine the trauma that they must have experienced when it was proven that Stefan was innocent, because they spent those 17 years whilst he was in prison thinking that the case was closed, that Lesley had gotten justice. So to then learn that actually that wasn't the case, that the police had got it so very wrong, and that Lesley's killer was actually still out there somewhere, it must have been devastating. It must have just reopened those old wounds from years ago when Lesley was killed in 1975. Now, you may be wondering whether or not the police and the detectives involved in Stefan Kiszko's arrest were in any way punished for their part in his wrongful conviction. Well, in 1994, 2 people involved in the case were charged in relation to withholding the evidence that could have proved Stefan's innocence at trial. Those 2 people were Detective Superintendent Dick Holland, who I believe was the lead detective in the original murder inquiry into Lesley's death, and another man named Ronald Outeridge, the forensic scientist who worked on the case. Following Stefan's acquittal and release, they were both charged with, quote, doing acts to pervert the course of justice. However, the case against them never actually went to court. Neither Dick Holland nor Ronald Outeridge ended up going to trial, because their defense teams argued that due to how much time had passed since the crime, a fair trial would not be possible. And the magistrate at the time agreed, so the charges were dropped. As I understand it, no one in the police ever faced proper punishment for what they did to Stefan Kiszko, which is outrageous. But now that Stefan had been acquitted, that obviously meant that the investigation into Lesley's murder was reopened. Now the police had to find the real killer, and the case was handed over to Detective Chief Superintendent Max McLean, who was with the West Yorkshire Police. He was going to be the one leading this new investigation. And as part of this new investigation, Max and his team decided to basically go over everything again. They were going to go over all of the statements that had been taken in the original inquiry, all of the tips and the leads, everything in the case file. They really were going right back to square one. And eventually they did identify a new potential suspect in Lesley's case, a man named Raymond Hewlett, and he was a known paedophile. He was known to the police as he had a lengthy criminal history. Just 3 years before Lesley was killed in 1975, 1972, he was convicted of the abduction and sexual assault of a 12-year-old girl. A couple of years after this, he was convicted of the attempted rape of a 14-year-old girl, and he also tried to abduct another young girl at knife point on one occasion. He was an incredibly dangerous man, a child sexual predator. In fact, according to online articles, he was even later a suspect in the Madeleine McCann case at one point, because at the time of Madeleine's disappearance in 2007, he was living in Portugal, only about an hour or so away from where she vanished. So when Lesley's case was reopened, Hewlett was looked at as a suspect. I mean, he definitely fit the profile of what the killer would have been like. And according to sources, at the time of her murder, he lived only about 10 miles away from Rockdale, where obviously Lesley lived and was abducted from. Even Lesley's family, when they learned about Raymond Hewlett, they became convinced that he could have done it. He could have been the perpetrator. They were so convinced to the point where they basically began campaigning for the police to arrest him and prosecute him for Lesley's death. But the problem was the police just did not have sufficient evidence to charge Hewlett with the crime. The family even considered going down the route of bringing a private prosecution against Hewlett without the police, but again, the evidence just was not there to be able to move forward with that. So it was difficult because the police couldn't really rule Hewlett out as being the killer, but they also couldn't arrest him. For the time being, they just had to continue looking for evidence that could either rule him in or rule him out, and also continue looking for other potential people of interest. And one line of inquiry that the police decided to revisit in the year 2000 was forensic science, because of course by this time it had been 25 years since Lesley's murder, and DNA and forensic technology had come a hell of a long way. I mean, like we discussed earlier on in the video, when Lesley was killed, they were able to detect traces of the killer's semen on her knickers, but they couldn't do anything with this evidence at the time. They couldn't get a DNA profile from it because that kind of technology just did not exist yet. But by now, by the year 2000, there had been major advances and developments in forensic science, and so the police were keen to see if forensic science could finally provide the breakthrough that this case so desperately needed and once and for all identify Lesley's murderer. The police wanted to send all of the evidence in the case, so basically Lesley's clothing, the clothes that she was wearing on the day she was killed, they wanted to send this off for testing in the hopes that scientists might be able to collect some of the attacker's DNA. However, it turns out that this evidence, the clothing, was actually destroyed about a decade after her death in 1985, because obviously it wasn't thought that it was ever going to be needed now. Everyone still thought that Stefan Kiszko was the killer. He was behind bars and the case was considered closed. So yeah, Lesley's clothes were long gone. But thankfully, not everything had been destroyed. Some evidence had been kept and preserved in storage all this time. It was some tapings. Basically, back when Lesley's body was found in 1975, scientists used strips of sellotape to try and pick up any fibres from Lesley's knickers. They would stick this sellotape down on the knickers and then pull it off to see what was on it, and these tapings hadn't been destroyed. So the police team who were conducting the new investigation into the murder had them at their disposal. Now, we know that semen was found in Lesley's knickers, so the police began thinking that maybe scientists would be able to detect traces of semen on these tapings and then get a DNA profile from the semen a quarter of a century after the crime. So the tapings were sent off for testing, and luckily they were successful. There was semen on these tapings and they were able to get a DNA profile of the perpetrator from it. So this was obviously a major development in the case. They could now use this DNA profile to compare against any suspects that there had been in the case so far and any future suspects that they may have. So of course the first people that the police wanted to compare this DNA profile against was, I guess, the two biggest suspects there had had been in the case over the years, Stefan, Kiszko and Raymond Hewlett, and as expected, Stefan's DNA was not a match to that of the killers, further proving that he was innocent, and actually neither was Raymond Hewlett. His DNA wasn't a match, so despite the suspicion towards him, he was also innocent of Lesley's murder anyway. So following this, the DNA profile was entered onto the National DNA Database in the hopes that a match would pop up, but unfortunately one didn't. The killer's DNA was not on the database. They even entered the profile into the International DNA Database. I think it's called Interpol, but again, there was no match. Although, if I remember correctly, Interpol was only established in the early 2000s anyway. But yeah, no match, which was a setback for the police. I can imagine that it was very, very disappointing for them. They'd waited so long to be able to get a DNA profile, and then when they finally did, they couldn't even get a match. So it seemed as though it was going to be another waiting game. They were going to have to keep looking into other potential suspects and also regularly checking the databases for a match to the killer's DNA. But finally, a couple of years later, in October of 2005, it appeared as though the wait was over, because finally a match had come back. The match came following the arrest of a 53-year-old man in Oldham, which is a town in Manchester. Oldham is just under 7 miles away from Rockdale, and the reason this man was arrested was because of an incident following a sex worker. He had gone to meet this sex worker in a hotel room, and afterwards she contacted the police and accused this man of assaulting her. Some sources say that he sexually assaulted her, whereas others say that he physically assaulted her because they disagreed regarding, I think, either the payment or what he wanted her to do. He wanted her to do something and she wasn't comfortable with it and said no, and then I think he became violent. Whatever the circumstances, he was arrested, although he was never actually charged with anything in relation to that. No charges were brought against him. However, this man's DNA was still taken because just a couple of years before this, the law changed in England and Wales, and it meant that anyone who was ever arrested would have to give a DNA sample even if they weren't going to be charged with a crime. So this man's DNA sample was taken, he was then released from custody, and his DNA was entered onto the National DNA Database. And when his DNA was entered on there, it ultimately came up as a match to the DNA in the Lesley Molseed case. This man was Lesley's killer, and his name was Ronald Castree. He was a local man. He actually lived in Rockdale at the time of Lesley's murder. I believe he lived on Oldham Road in Rockdale, which is less than a mile away from where Lesley lived. And he was a sex offender, a child sexual predator. He was a paedophile. But before we continue with the case, let me just tell you a little bit more about Ronald Castree and the truly evil and sadistic man that he was. So Ronald Castree was born on the 18th of October 1953 in the town of Littleborough in Manchester. So he had lived in and around the area of Rockdale his whole life, I believe. He was born to parents Eric and Marjorie Castree, and they were pretty well off, to be fair. I don't think they were mega rich, but they had money. They were financially stable, and so they were able to send Ronald to a private school. He was able to, you know, do like extracurricular activities, and Ronald was their only child, so there is some indication that he was probably quite spoiled by his parents, particularly by his mother. You see, Ronald had very different relationships with both his mother and his father. Apparently his mother was very caring towards Ronald, very giving. She was the one that would spoil him, and she basically worshipped the ground that her son walked on. He could do no wrong in her eyes. Whereas Ronald's father, Eric, was the opposite. He wasn't loving towards Ronald at all. He was horrible to Ronald, to be honest. He would have a go at him and criticize him all the time, call him names. He would basically bully his own son. So whilst his mother was always very nice to him, his dad was always nasty and negative. And I can imagine that that must have been a very confusing household to grow up in, with his mum making out like he was the best thing to ever walk the earth and his dad making him feel the complete opposite of that. But in terms of money and stability, Ronald grew up with quite a privileged life, and when he was 19 years old in 1973, he met the woman that he would go on to marry, a young woman named Beverly, who was 3 years younger than him. She was only 16 years old when they met. They soon tied the knot, they moved in together, and they decided to have children, which is what Beverly so desperately wanted. She'd always wanted to have her own family. So just 2 years after they met and married in 1975, the couple had their first baby, a little boy named Jason. Although some sources state that Ronald wasn't actually Jason's biological father. Sources state that Beverly actually had an affair with another man and that this man was Jason's dad, but I'm guessing it was agreed that Ronald would just raise him as his own. As I understand it, Beverly had to stay in the hospital for a little while a few weeks after Jason was born, as she had deep vein thrombosis. She was admitted into the hospital on the 3rd of October 1975, and she was kept in and monitored for about a week or so. And it turns out that it was just 2 days after she was admitted when 11-year-old Lesley Molseed went missing and was murdered. Ronald Castree abducted and killed Lesley whilst his wife was in the hospital, and just weeks after their son had been born. Some sources even state that he was literally on his way to the hospital to visit his wife when he spotted Lesley and decided to abduct her. And Beverly was none the wiser. She had absolutely no idea about what her husband had done because he managed to get away with it for so long. As we know, Stefan Kiszko was quickly in the frame, allowing Castree to fly under the radar, allowing him to re-offend and commit other very similar crimes against children. In fact, just 3 weeks before Stefan's trial for murder began in 1976, so just the year following Lesley's murder, Ronald abducted another young girl who lived pretty close to where Lesley lived in Rockdale. This girl was just 9 years old at the time, and on the 3rd of July 1976, Ronald kidnapped her. He put her in his vehicle and he took her to this abandoned house or abandoned garage, and it was there where he sexually assaulted her. By some miracle, this little girl managed to get out of that house and escape Ronald Castree with her life. And Castree was caught for this crime. He was arrested and charged with gross indecency and indecent assault, which he pleaded guilty to, but unbelievably, he wasn't even sent to prison for this. His punishment for abducting and sexually assaulting a child was a fine of £50. £25 for each charge, which I think in today's money would be worth around £700, just over maybe. He was an incredibly dangerous man, a huge threat towards children, and yet he just got a fine. Basically a slap on the wrist. And so of course he went on to do it again. Just 2 years later, in July of 1978, he was arrested after he assaulted a young boy. He was charged with another count of indecent assault, and once again he was just given a fine of £50, which honestly makes my blood boil. I cannot believe that he was convicted of 2 sexual crimes against children within just 2 years of each other, and both times it was thought that the appropriate punishment was a fine. It's insane. Just the year following this conviction and 4 years after their first child, Jason, was born in 1979, Ronald and his wife Beverly had a second child, another son who they named Nick. And 5 years after Nick came their third child, again another boy called Daniel. And Nick in particular has spoken out publicly since finding out about what his dad did. He has spoken out about his and his brothers' childhoods, what it was like living with their father, and honestly, it just sounds horrific. The way Ronald treated his family was just vile. Nick has very, very few happy memories of his childhood because his father was incredibly abusive towards his sons and also his wife Beverly. Nick recalls how his mum and dad would argue often and how these arguments led to his father being violent towards his mother. Ronald hit and beat Beverly on several different occasions. She would often have bruises on her from the injuries that she sustained. The way he treated his wife was just despicable. He would punish Beverly all the time for things that he believed she had done wrong. So for example, Nick said that his father used to beat his mother if she hadn't cleaned the house, or if she hadn't made dinner. If she hadn't brought him a drink in the evening, he would turn violent. On one occasion, he even broke Beverly's nose during an attack. But as well as being physically abusive towards Beverly, he was also just mentally and emotionally abusive too. He bullied his wife, constantly telling her that she was worthless and useless, that she could never do anything right. And he treated his sons the same too. He would bully his sons. I have a quote here from Nick, and he said, "My father was like a powder keg waiting to go off. We were always waiting for the next explosion. The only happy times were on holiday when we were away from the family home. We'd come in from school, and if we made the slightest bit of noise, he would tell us to F off out the room. He'd throw meals at the wall, put his fist through the wall. He was a bully. He'd go on a drunken rampage when he drank a bottle of whiskey a night." Ronald was particularly violent to the oldest of the three brothers, Jason. Jason was regularly beaten by Ronald, just like Beverly was. I'm guessing that Ronald probably held a lot of resentment and anger towards Jason because he allegedly was the result of an affair that Beverly had in the beginning of their marriage, so he would take that out on Jason as he grew up. There was just no love in the household at all. Nick said that he and his siblings weren't shown any kind of love or affection by both their father and their mother Beverly. He said that their mother was unable to show the kids love because she was so psychologically scarred by how Ronald had treated her. She was traumatized by everything he had done to her, and I can imagine that she was probably just too frightened to show any love towards their children because Ronald never did, and she was probably terrified to go against him. She never felt like she could stand up to him. It was way too dangerous for her to do so. As Nick got older in his teenage years, he started to question his sexuality, and he realized that he was gay, and his father would bully him for that. He would make homophobic comments towards his son and call him homophobic slurs, and he started doing this before Nick himself even realized that he was gay. Before he even knew what those words meant, his father was calling him homophobic slurs. In addition to everything else, Ronald Castree was also unfaithful to his wife. I think pretty much throughout their entire marriage, he would cheat on her with several different women. He would often use sex workers, and he made no attempt to hide it whatsoever. He would literally tell his wife and his children that he was going out to find a woman to sleep with. He knew that Beverly would never try to stop him because he knew full well that he scared the living daylights out of her, so she would never dare to. Now, much like Ronald's father, Eric Castree, was also a child sexual predator himself. He was arrested and convicted at one point for for indecency towards a child, and so the apple didn't fall far from the tree, clearly. And Ronald's son, Nick, has also very, very bravely opened up about how he was sexually abused by his grandfather, Eric, during his early teenage years. When Nick was just 14 years old, his grandfather took him on a trip to London and they were staying in a hotel. However, one night when they were in the hotel, Eric sexually assaulted his grandson. And I believe this was just the start of the sexual abuse. It continued after this until the day that his grandfather died, and I can't even imagine the trauma that that must have left Nick with. And Nick never actually told anyone about what his grandfather did to him at the time because he was too scared to. So I don't believe Eric ever faced punishment for that. But Nick says that he has wondered whether or not his father Ronald may have been the victim of sexual abuse at the hands of his grandfather too, Ronald's father. Was Ronald abused as a kid? And that's partly the reason why he turned out the way that he did. Now, after 20 years of marriage in 1996, 20 years of horrendous abuse at the hands of her husband, Beverly finally decided to leave him. However, she decided to do it in secret. I don't think she told him that she was going to leave him because she was too scared about what he might do. Beverly and Ronald's second child, Nick, who by this point was 17 years old, he had already made the decision to move out, and he agreed to take his mum and his younger brother Daniel with him so that they could finally escape their father's abuse. So one day, whilst Ronald was working in the comic book shop that he ran, Nick and his mum and his brother quickly packed their bags. They loaded the bags into Nick's car and they left. They moved into a rented house and they were finally able to start a new life free from abuse and violence. And just the year after this, in 1997, Beverly and Ronald officially divorced. Ronald eventually met another woman whom he would go on to marry, a woman named Karen. I believe they met in 2003 and married in 2005, and he moved in with her and her 3 children. He became a stepfather to her 3 kids. They lived in a house on a road called Brandon Crescent in Shaw, Oldham, not far from Rockdale. However, they weren't married for long before Ronald's second wife Karen was made aware of her new husband's true colours, because as we know, it was later that year in October of 2005 when Ronald's DNA was entered onto the National DNA database after he was arrested for assaulting a sex worker in a hotel room. And when it was entered onto the database, it flagged up as a match to the DNA, the semen evidence that had been collected from tapings from Lesley Molseed's knickers. Finally, after more than 3 decades, the police had identified Lesley's killer, and it was Ronald Castree. Ronald Castree was arrested on suspicion of Lesley's murder on the 5th of November 2006. He was arrested at his home and he was taken to the police station. And when his family, when his sons and his ex-wife Beverly were informed that he had been arrested for the murder of a child, they were not the least bit surprised. They knew the kind of man that Ronald was, an evil, violent sexual predator. So when they found out what he did, of course they were horrified, but they weren't shocked. Following his arrest, Ronald was interviewed by the detectives, and of course, being the coward that he was, he denied it. Despite the DNA evidence there was linking him to the crime, he was adamant that he was not the one responsible.
I have no knowledge, and I've certainly never met this dead girl or any member of her family. I have no knowledge as to how you come to say a sample of my DNA is found at that place, especially after 30 years.
Just the day after his arrest, Castree was charged with murder, and as expected, when it came to his plea hearing, he pleaded not guilty, and so the case went to trial. And his trial began on the 23rd of October 2007 at Bradford Crown Court, and one of the key witnesses for the prosecution was Ronald's ex-wife, Beverly. She very bravely found the courage to tell the court all about the horrendous abuse that she was subjected to by her ex-husband during their 20-year marriage, and she was so terrified that he was going to be found not guilty and be released. Of course, she wanted to give evidence, and she did it because she wanted to help the case. She wanted to help Lesley's family finally get justice, but she was so frightened that he would be acquitted and that once he was released, he would find Beverly and kill her as revenge for giving evidence against him. Another witness brought forward by the prosecution was one of the children that Ronald abused, that 9-year-old girl that he abducted and sexually assaulted just the year after Lesley was killed. I think by the time of the trial in 2007, she would have been in her early 30s, and she gave evidence during the trial. She talked about what she could remember about the day that Ronald attacked her. And when the trial came to an end, the jury was sent off to deliberate, and on the 12th of November 2007, they returned with a verdict of guilty. Ronald Castree was guilty of the murder of 11-year-old Lesley Molseed, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years, which means that he won't be eligible for parole until he is 83 years old in 2036, and even then it's highly unlikely that he will actually be released. Of course, Lesley's family were absolutely over the moon with the outcome of the trial. They were so relieved that after, gosh, more than 32 years, her real killer had finally been convicted. Finally, she had justice. But heartbreakingly, not every member of Lesley's family was around to see justice be served, because one of Lesley's siblings, her older brother Fred, who was just 12 years old when his sister was killed, he took his own life in March of 2005 at the age of 41. He passed away just 7 months before the DNA match was made to Ronald Castree. So he died having never found out the identity of his sister's killer, which is just heartbreaking. Even more tragedy for the family. I can't even begin to comprehend just how hard that must have been for them to lose Lesley and then lose Fred too. A very sad note to end on, but that concludes this case. That is the case of Lesley Molseed. It's infuriating that Ronald Castree was just a free man for so long after Lesley's death. He must have thought that he had gotten away with it. He would never be caught for what he did to her. But thank God he was wrong, and although it took so long for justice to be served, at least finally Lesley's family were able to get some answers and some closure. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys have to say. Also, feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know down below in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye!